The wind that threaded the red stones had a voice like the rasp of a whetstone, a dry, steady whisper that chewed at the edges of thought. The Tower of Joy stood against it, pale as an old bone in the mountain's ribs. Its shadow cast thinly over a slope of thorn and scree where blood was drying into the earth. The smell of it, iron and spiced dust, lay heavy in the heat. It made flies bold. They walked the corners of men's mouths and scaled the damp ladders of their beards. Crows were gathering in small, uncertain knots, hopping along the rocks and cocking black eyes at the bright thing that lay upon a shard of stone as if it were a fallen splinter of dawn itself. Sir Arthur Dayne had put his hand atop the flat of the blade so that it would not slide, fingers finding their place as they always had along the mirrored steel. His hands shook. The blade did not. He was half sat, half sprawled against a red boulder that had warmed under the sun brighter than any hearthstone. He could feel its heat through the rent in his mail as surely as he felt his own heart strike each rib before the next breath came. A ragged scrap of white had once been a cloak. It clung to him like a second skin of dust and sanguine. From its folds rose the clean, obstinate glimmer of dawn's edge. He had killed 3 good men beneath the pale tower, and had near killed a 4th. He had watched his friend, his fellow, his brother in vows, Gerald's dark eyes dimming under the weight of a broken sky. He had stood his ground because standing was all there was left to do. Now his breath ran short as a spent tide, and every pull of the wind through the pass drew his tongue to the desert's salt. Bootsteps crunched. Sir Arthur did not lift his head. He did not need to. The steps belonged to a man who carried the weight of his duty in his gait, a man who did not quicken in victory, nor falter in grief. When Eddard Stark came to stand over him, the shadow that fell across Sir Arthur's face was long and cool. "Drink," Lord Stark said, and a skin was pressed to Arthur's mouth. It would have been easier to clamp his jaw and spit, easier to deny the hand, deny the enemy, deny the world that had lived beyond this mountain, and would insist on living after the swords went silent. But the water was warm and honest, and it washed the grit from his teeth, and for a moment he remembered a night on the Green Fork, when the campfire had burned low and Rhaegar had spoken of songs. The prince had believed that music might temper steel. Arthur had told him steel had to be steel. The memory was a blade with 2 edges. He swallowed, coughed, and the skin was lifted away. "Howland?" Sir Arthur asked. The word came out wrong, as if he had spent half his tongue and spoke around the absence. "Alive," Stark said. A pause. "Your men are dead." "They were," Arthur said. "Mine." He opened his eyes wider, making the world agree to be the world. Sunlight burned the edges of stones into hard lines. A figure stooped to lift something from the ground and wrapped it in cloth. Gerald's sword, perhaps. Another man knelt by the bodies, cutting strips of cloak to bind the wounds of those who still walked. There were fewer of them than there had been at dawn. Eddard Stark followed Arthur's eyes, and then returned his gaze to the man slumped against the stone. "I want no more dead today." "Then you should have turned back," Arthur said, and was surprised by the lack of bitterness in the words. They came out tired, nearly soft. "But then you would not be Eddard Stark, and I would not be Arthur Dayne." "That is true." Stark crouched, putting himself near the level of Arthur's eyes. They were gray, those eyes, as the sea before a storm. There was something in them that Arthur recognized. It was not victory. It was a weight he himself had learned to carry long ago. The knowledge that what you had done could be justified, and would still be a wound you would tend forever. "Sir," he said, voice steady, "I will ask you to yield." "I yielded the day I took my vows," Arthur said quietly. "But I see the shape of your question." He glanced toward the tower. He had not looked at it since he had heard the screams turn to moans, and the moans turn to a hush like wind through thin reeds. The tower stood unburnt. Its pale stones did not remember any of it. "Is it done?" "There is a child," Stark said. Arthur closed his eyes for the breath of a heartbeat. Then he opened them again. "There is a child. His mother is dead." There were words for that. There were words and curses and prayers. Arthur found none of them. A thin, high cry sounded from within the tower, the sound a hawk might make if it dreamed of being a man's son. It pierced the dry air and drew every head without the consent of the men whose necks turned. Arthur felt the way his hand tightened on Dawn's flat, as if the blade might fly without him, and do some good deed that men could no longer manage alone. "You might kill me now," Arthur said. "It would be kinder to your king." "Robert is not here," Stark said. "I am. And there are some things that were never his to command." "Lyanna was never his to command," Arthur said, bones weary with it. He had not meant to say the name. It came anyway, and hung in the sun between them, like a thing that cast its own coolness. Eddard's mouth tightened, but he did not look away. "No," Arthur said, answering himself. "Not his to command, nor mine to save. Mend us all. The child will live," Stark said, and the certainty in his voice surprised Arthur more than any blade could have. "He will live. He will not be harmed by you or yours or any man who ever called your king his king." "Swear it," Arthur exhaled. He had made oaths at 11, at 16, at 20, at 23, each deeper than the last, each binding him more surely to a story he had believed made better sense than other men's. This one would be different. He turned his palm and felt the cool chisel of Dawn's edge against his skin. His hand remembered how to curl around a hilt, even when his heart was unlearning it. He pushed himself a fraction more upright. The world swam and settled. "I swear," he said. "On what?" It was not defiance. It was the voice of a man who took measure of the world before he moved in it. "On the honor of House Dayne. On my sword." He would not say on the 7. He had prayed in the little chapel of Starfall when his mother had been sick, and had prayed again over Elias' little son's cradle, and the gods had been as far and as near as the wind. It was enough. "I swear that I will not lift hand or steel against the babe. I will protect him if my protecting does not betray the vows that bind me already." "That last," Stark said, mouth thinner, "is a line you could drive a caravan through." Arthur's lips curved. It was almost a smile. A man bound to one duty cannot easily take up another without undoing the first. "But I swear that I will not betray him. And if a moment comes, when my oath to him becomes the measure of my oath to the realm, I will choose as a knight should." He let the blade tilt and set Dawn's point against the rock, the white steel gleaming. "And I will yield my sword." "You would not yield it to Robert." Arthur shook his head, and pain struck bright. He kept his breath from turning into a groan by will. "No, Dot. But you are not Robert. Take the sword, Eddard Stark. Carry it to Starfall. Put it into my sister's hands if I cannot. Tell Ashara that I am not dead, and that I go where I must go. And you should go to Starfall yourself," Stark said. But he took the white blade in his hands, surprise flickering across his face at its lightness. "You should go home." "I will, but not yet." He looked at the tower, and could not for a long moment peel his eyes away. "When we were boys," he said, "Gerald and I used to pretend the tower at Starfall was a spear set upright in the gods' hands. We would climb it and look down over the green and the white stone, and it all made sense from that height. The world does not look different from higher ground, Stark. It only looks smaller. The distances still kill you when you try to cross them." "Dayne, you are bleeding." "A great deal," Arthur agreed. "Will you have me chained?" Eddard Stark looked over his shoulder at the men who had survived the fight. Howland Reed stood with the flat of a spear under his palm, his reckoning eyes dark with some old water that did not dry under any sun. The tall younger knight with the north in his bones watched with the stillness of a man at the edge of a cliff. Another bound his own forearm with a strip of linen torn from a dead brother's cloak. "No," Stark said. "If I meant to kill you, I would have done it while you were standing. If I meant to drag you like a dog, I would have bound you already." He looked back to Arthur. "If you mean to stand and walk out of here, you will need my arm." Arthur looked at the offered hand without touching it. The wind ran its whetstone song along stone and steel. "I will take your arm," he said at last. "But you will give me something else first." "What?" "Time to say farewell." Eddard Stark's jaw worked once. He nodded. He came to his feet and turned away. leaving Arthur propped against the blood-warmed rock with the shadow of the tower stretching thin across his boots. The child within cried again, then stilled. Arthur listened to that quiet. He thought of Elia. Her voice, her hands, the way she watched her children sleep, as if by watching she could keep them from the hard corners of the world. He thought of Rhaegar, whose song had failed, and whose sword had failed, and whose heart, which had been his truest weapon, had found nothing to cut but himself. He thought of Ashara on the tower walkway above the water, laughing at something he had said that could not possibly have been witty. The laugh had been like the moment before a gull takes air. He had wanted to be enough to keep her on the ground and wanted to be the wind under her. All at once, he pushed himself to his feet because lying down was a thing for the dead. Pain came. It did not make demands beyond that he acknowledge it. He did. He walked among the bodies of those he had loved as brothers, and touched his fingers to the brows of each before the men of the north came and raised them, and bore them to a cairn raised of red stone, in a heat that stung the eyes. He spoke no words. No words were sturdy enough to hold what this had been. He placed a stone, and then another. The tower watched. When he was done, he went inside to look upon the face of a woman, whose story he had not been able to change. It was a matter of minutes. It lasted forever. He left the tower with a bandage like an insult over his side, his shirt stuck to his skin, his sword belt empty. Dawn had always been quiet. He had not realized how loudly silence could ring without that weight at his hip. "Come," Eddard Stark said, and Arthur came. They went down out of the Red Mountains in a convoy that did not trust itself to call itself a convoy. The men were quiet as cattle in a thunderstorm, each with his own storm to walk under. Howland Reed moved with a peculiar care, as if his feet remembered marsh paths and were wary of crumbling ground disguised as road. He watched Arthur sometimes, and when he did, his gaze had no malice in it. Something older. Curiosity, maybe, or the recognition between men who had both gone into a place where words were thinner than breath, and come out with the knowledge they had left some of themselves behind. At dusk on the second day, the red stone gave up its hold, and they came upon a low green valley, where a spring made music among flat rocks. They camped there. A woman who had come down from the tower cradled the child like a cargo that had to be delivered to a port not marked on any chart. She fed him with a calm that seemed to Arthur like a defiance of the world's madness. When the child slept, she slept while seated, the bundle in her arms and her back against a rock. Arthur did not approach her. He wanted to. He did not. He sat instead under the brittle shade of a thorn, watching the stars assert themselves one by one. The sky here had a peculiar cleanness. The night was not black, but a deepening of blue that seemed to pool rather than spread. He could pick out the sword above the horizon, the pale scatter of the milky road. The 7 wandering glitterings, men called the 7 and women called by the names their mothers had taught them. He thought of the oath he had sworn, and of the blade he had yielded, and a strange sense came over him. Like a man who sets a pack down after a long climb and feels his spine aware of its own weight for the first time in years. "Do you ever sleep, sir?" Howland Reed's voice did not startle him. The Crannog man moved as reeds do when a wind runs through them. The movement was the wind's. "Not when there are stars to count," Arthur said. Reed came to sit across from him, cross-legged, hands resting on his knees. A frog bone charm dangled from a rawhide thong at his throat, and something about the way it caught starlight made Arthur think of old habits of belief that had nothing to do with marble septs. They sat a while in quiet. A fox coughed somewhere to the west. The spring made its soft, steady talk. "You are thinking of leaving us," Reed said at last. "Everyone leaves everyone," Arthur said, too weary for evasions. "This is only the manner of it. You could ride north," Reed said. "You could take a new name. You know that you could." "The vows on my tongue still count," Arthur said. "I would not have them turn sour there." Reed studied him through the dark. "You mean to go to Robert Baratheon?" "I mean to go where my oath leads. That is the road that doesn't end until it does." "You will wear the white for him?" "Perhaps," Arthur said, and felt the strangeness of it carefully, like a man working a stone out of a boot. "If I am asked." If I am permitted. If by wearing it, I can put a little weight on the scale that has been driving this realm into fire. Reed shifted and looked off toward the sleeping bundle, and the woman's bowed head. There are scales the crown does not see. More reason for men who do to stand where they are visible, Arthur said. He felt Reed's eyes return to him and let them settle. You do not trust me. I trust you to keep the vows you know how to keep, Reed said. But there are other oaths. They are not spoken. They are not recorded in any book. They live in the places we come from. I know, Arthur said, and thought of the river sound in the palm where starfall met the sea. Reed nodded once, as if a problem had been set and solved. When you come to the crossroads, he said, you will not be alone. I am never alone, Arthur said, and spoke as if to himself. That is the trouble, and the remedy both. He slept toward dawn, when the cold seeped up from the ground and asked for body heat. He woke with the light and the ache, ate hard bread and salt beef, drank spring water that had the taste of stone. He watched Eddard Stark lift the child into his arms, as if weighing him against something only he could see. They moved on. They parted under the shadow of a standing stone carved with old Roynish whorls. The road turned west to Starfall, north to the Tor, east toward King's Landing. Eddard Stark's men looked to him without asking, and he looked to the east without disguise. He meant to go to his king. Will you take the sword? Arthur asked him quietly before they went their ways. I will carry it to Starfall as you asked, Stark said. He hesitated. The first hesitation Arthur had seen in him. I will speak to your sister. Tell her, Arthur said, each word measured carefully so as not to spill anything that would drown him, that I am not done, and that if I have done wrong, I will spend the rest of my breath on making it right. Nendasal. Eddard Stark's mouth softened. I will tell her what I can tell and no more. He lifted the child a little, as if to remind himself of the weight. His eyes tracked the road north, and something like a storm crossed the gray of them, and went on. We will not speak of this again. Arthur bowed his head. We already have said more than the world can afford. They rode apart. He took the east. The road crawled out of the red mountains and onto the hard flat that lay like a hammered shield before the capital. The heat took on a different shape there, less knife than hammer. The dust came up in small, resentful puffs at each hoof-fall, coating his boots, his legs, his tongue. He passed men who watched him from under brims and behind kerchiefs, and none of them knew the name of the knight whose side bled through his shirt. The city grew ahead of him like an unhealed wound, stitched with gold. The air tasted of brine and tanneries and men. The gates stood open to the business of a realm that had been nearly broken and would now go on breaking, because that is what realms do. The throne room smelled faintly of old smoke. The tapestries had been rehung to cover the burned places. The iron in the air had a sourness to it. Men stood where men always stand, at the foot of a barbed mountain that some mad smith had dreamed. New banners drooped where old ones had been torn down. The stag leapt where the dragon had been, and even the lion's colors seemed brighter for the blood that had drawn them here. Arthur walked between ranks of guards, whose eyes flicked to the emptiness at his hip, and then to the bandage at his side, and back up again, in a rhythm that remembered drills. He went forward until a hand lifted in a gesture that said, Stop there. He did. The man who had raised the hand had hair black as a coal and a beard like thorns. He wore his crown as if it had grown there overnight, and might put roots into his skull if he gave it leave. Robert Baratheon had been handsome once in the way a young bull is handsome. He was still young. The handsomeness had already begun to thicken into something less tidy. He leaned forward on the arm of the iron chair and squinted a little, as if the light had changed since he had sat down, and the room had not had the courtesy to inform him. Sir Arthur Dayne, Robert said, and the throne room shifted as men's weight moved from foot to foot in the wake of the name. You have the gall of 7 men, walking in here like you've come to petition for grain from the winter stores. I have come to bend the knee, Arthur said. He did not kneel. Not yet. He was not a man given to theater. But there are times when gesture shapes truth. He waited for the right shape. A voice like old parchment crinkling said, Bold words. Pycelle. sweating under his chain. Another voice came soft and dry from a cloud of perfume. Wise ones. Varys, the whispering spider. Eyes like polished beads. Near the base of the throne, a golden youth lounged against a pillar with a cat's boredom and a swordsman's watchfulness. Jaime Lannister, one hand resting not far from the pommel of a blade that had made him a story before he had quite learned to keep his temper. Barristan Selmy stood half a pace behind the king's right shoulder, white as an oath and as spare. His face did not change when he saw Arthur. The slight straightening of his spine, though, was a greeting as deep as any embrace. "Bend the knee," Robert repeated, and the words seemed to taste odd in his mouth. "To me." "To the realm," Arthur said. He heard the choice when it left him, and he did not call it back. "Which you hold." He let the silence stretch, and then went to one knee with the grace that had earned him 100 ballads. Even now the gesture was clean. The Iron Throne's shadow cut across his face. "I am a knight of the King's Guard. I am sworn to the King." "The King is you." Robert laughed, a sound that came rough and genuine from somewhere deep. "Clever," he said. "Clever as any maester. And yet you fought me to keep the dragon's whelp on his high seat." "I fought because I was bound," Arthur said. He stayed where he was, each word chosen as carefully as if he were picking a path across a river on flat stones. "I fought for Elia's children. I fought for vows. I am here for vows still." Jaime shifted against the pillar. "A vow can be spun to bind any man to any whim," he said lazily. "Ask a Lannister about the worth of promises." "A vow binds a man to himself," Arthur said without looking at him. "If he lies, he knows it." Jon Arryn, calm in bird-gray, looked between them all with the weary patience of a man sorting the quarrels of sons. "Your Grace," he said to Robert, "we will have 1,000 men to deal with in the next year who bent the knee because their bellies demanded it. If we mean to rule rather than merely sit a chair until we fall from it drunk, we will need the ones who kneel, because they understand why knees exist." "Endo." "Bah," Robert said, but his eyes did not leave Arthur. "And you, Sword of the Morning? Do you understand?" Arthur lifted his head. "I understand that the crown has to sit somewhere whether or not the head beneath it is the one I would have chosen. I understand that a man can put his strength in service to a realm larger than any house. I understand the shape of your rage. I have my own. I mean to set mine such work as it may do and no more." "Then shall." Robert's mouth twitched. "You talk like a Septon and a sellsword had a child together." He leaned forward. "Why should I trust you? Your prince stole the woman I loved. Your king burned fathers. Your brothers in white stood this side of justice and called it duty." "My prince died for the thing he believed in," Arthur said. "My king died for the thing he would not stop being. My brothers died at a tower because the world does not forgive men who keep their promises to the wrong end. I am left. I am asking you to make use of what I have left." "Dayne?" Eddard Stark had said once that Robert admired plain speaking and courage in equal measure. Arthur watched the way the Baratheon's broad hands curved over the chair's hard iron. He saw how the eyes under that thatch of dark hair softened and sharpened. He heard the long breath the king took and released. "You are a prideful bastard," Robert said almost amiably. "Even bled and empty as a wineskin. You managed to be a tale men will tell around fires." He made a small motion. Barristan stepped forward a fraction. The king slanted a glance at him, then at Jaime. Arthur did not need more years to read what passed between them. One man of tempered honor who had served under 3 kings and still carried himself as if the next oath might be the one that set his soul to rest. One man of bright gold who had done one thing that would never be undone and was learning how to stand inside its shadow. Robert put his big hand out, palm down. "Rise," he said. Arthur rose. His head swam for a moment. He kept the room steady by pinning it with his eyes. "The white cloak?" Robert said lazily, waving a hand. "It is just wool. But for some men the wool is the world. You want it to mean what it used to mean. I want it to mean what it can," Arthur said. "Good." Robert's grin came like a slash. "Then wear it, and we'll see if you can teach it to be what you call it." His gaze flicked sideways. "Sell me?" "Your Grace," Barristan said. Would you have him at your side? Robert asked, almost idly. It was not idle. Nothing about this minute was. Barristan's eyes were very pale. He did not look at Arthur when he answered. I would rather have him before me than behind me, he said. The smallest hint of a smile troubled the edges of his mouth. At my side would be best. Robert laughed again. Done. He settled back, satisfaction making his voice looser for a heartbeat. On your feet. Sir Arthur Dayne, and welcome to the service of the stag. He scratched at his beard with thumb and forefinger. Asks for who leads my white swords. He let the thought dangle, a morsel before a pair of hounds. He watched the way Jaime tilted his head and Barristan did not. He watched Arthur, who did not move at all. He said, We will speak of that when men have slept and the day has lost its edge. Go get yourselves a cup of something that isn't piss and a bandage that isn't already covered in your blood. Arthur bowed. Not low. Just enough to show the hinge worked. He left the throne room at Barristan's side. The noise of it faded behind them, replaced by the long stone corridor's cool hush and the sound of their steps. It was a sound they had heard together before. On the way to a prince's bedside where a woman smiled through pain. On the way to a king whose mouth smelled of fire. It was different now. It was the same. You should be dead, Barristan said, after they had gone far enough that the pillars would crown any echoes before they reached ears that enjoyed carrying words. His tone held no reproach. It held a faint curiosity, the way a craftsman might regard a piece of work that refused to crack where it should have cracked. So should we all, Arthur said. And yet, Barristan agreed. They walked. You will find this court a different beast than the one we knew. I have eyes, Arthur said gently. I see where the gold sits. Jaime's not the worst thing that could have happened to us, Barristan said, which was the closest a man like him came to confession, and not the best. He is a boy who did a man's deed, Arthur said. He will be learning how to live inside his own tale. They turned into a small chamber where a squire with a scarred lip bowed so quickly he almost fell. Barristan waved him off and fetched a wine jug himself, pouring into 2 iron cups. The wine had the taste of new oak and ambition. Arthur swallowed it and felt its warmth ripple down his middle and settle thinly over the cold place inside him, where something had been wrenched out and would not grow back. Do you mean to challenge me for the command? Barristan asked without heat. No, Arthur said. The truth surprised him by how easily it came. If Robert asked me to command, I would do it. If he asked you, I would be content. I did not come here to be anything but what I have always been. Then you will be disappointed, Barristan said, and there was something like sorrow in it. Because none of us will be what we were. We can be examples, perhaps. We can be warnings. Arthur nodded. Warnings are a kind of example. Barristan regarded him a long moment, then nodded back. Come, he said. Let us find you a cloak that is clean. The cloak they found was not new. It had been stored for years and smelled faintly of lint and cedar oil. When Arthur swung it about his shoulders, the white fell in heavy folds that remembered men's hands. He touched the clasp and had the absurd thought that clothing himself in this old garment was like being wrapped in his own legend and sent back into battle with a new chapter to write. He slept that night on a pallet no softer than a camp bed, in a cell not much larger than the room where he had laid his head in the Red Keep when it belonged to another king. He dreamt of a child's cry and the sound of the spring over rock. He dreamt of Stark's gray gaze and of a tower that could not remember. He woke with the first shaft of light and rose when the bell in the sept told the morning hour, the sound of it rectifying the air. His first days as a king's knight under a new king were made of small things that refused to be small. He took the morning watch by the queen's door and learned the pattern of her lady's footsteps, the way the scents of rosewater and words unsaid preceded them down the corridor. Cersei Lannister looked at him with a coolness that had nothing to do with temperature. When she passed him, he did not look after her when she went by. He knew too much about pride to think his needed the ventilation. In the yard, he put a sword into his hand because a sword was the tool that had taught his muscles to remember themselves. He worked until the bandage under his shirt began to seep, and then a little more, because stopping when he should was a way of teaching other men to stop when they should not. Men watched him from the edges, gold cloaks with their private rankings, knights from the Reach whose hair smelled of crushed herbs and vanity, a few Northmen who found the capital's sun an affront to the idea of air. The squire with the scarred lip, whose name turned out to be Kale, watched close and eager, as if every stroke might be a word he could learn to pronounce. Jamie came to the yard on the third day with a bored look, and his hair unsure whether to fall into his eyes or stay out of them. He watched Arthur for a while with a half-smile that could be either admiration or appetite, then drew steel and stepped into the ring without preface. "See if your vows steady your hand," he said lightly. "They steady my feet," Arthur said, and lifted his blade. They crossed steel. Arthur's body knew this dance as surely as it knew how to drink water when a skin touched his mouth. Jamie was quick, and he was hungry in the way of young men whose names have reached taverns before their legs have truly earned them. He overreached once, twice, and on the third time, Arthur let him. He showed him the angle where his own blade could meet him, and would cut him, if he had not learned to turn his wrist that exact quarter of an inch. Jamie saw it. His eyes widened just enough to count as humility if you were patient and generous. He laughed, breathless, and broke away, circled, came again. When they were done, sweat stung Arthur's wound and Jamie's hair clung to his forehead, and the men who had watched pretended they had not. Jamie lowered his blade. "You are better than the songs," he said, abrupt. The admission caught on Thorne. He looked left, then right, as if to be certain no one had heard him. "And you are almost good as you say." Arthur lowered his own steel. "I do not say," he said mildly. "That is why they will let you say," Jamie replied, and the glint in his eye was not mockery. It was wariness, which was rarer and more valuable. He flicked sweat from his fingers and slid his blade home. "Whatever Robert does about the White Cloak's command, you and I will have work." Arthur nodded. "We already have begun." Jamie grinned and went away with his long stride and his irritation at the sun. In the small council chamber, where the air was stale and full of decisions, Arthur learned the cadence of voices that would shape the realm as surely as the king's shouting in the yard did. Varys's phrases came like lace dropped delicately upon plates of meat. Pycelle droned like a hive of sluggish bees. Stannis Baratheon's words were iron filings that resisted being drawn to any magnet save duty. Jon Arryn stacked his sentences neatly and left room between them for men to place their own thoughts if they had any. Little of that had to do with him yet. His power was in the way he stood, in the way the white at his shoulders took the candlelight and made it honest. He did not speak often. When he did, the men turned because they had been boys once, and stories told at boys' bedsides sink deeper than reason. News came like weather. It was always arriving. A Manderley ship grounded in a squall off Dragonstone. Raiders in the Stepstones. A sellsword company changing its name in the disputed lands. A new singer in Fleabottom who had found a rhyme for Kingslayer. Under it all, a low persistent growl. Dorne. Men thought of Alia's blood and her children's blood, and the smashed pearl of her skull against a wall. They waited for spears to lift like a field of barley in a wind. They watched the roads to the Bone Way and the princes pass, as if the red stone itself might march. A letter came instead, written on a vellum so thin the quill left the faintest imprint. It bore the sun and spear. Its words were water under a bridge that had never been new. Measured, careful, spared of adjectives, full of the space between lines. Prince Doran Martell wrote, "The deserts keep their dead. The living must keep the peace that remains to them." The prince wrote, "The blood we cannot restore must not be spilled again as if it would call the ghosts back." The prince wrote, "There are roads that turn us toward the sea rather than toward the mountains, and men who choose them." When Robert flung the letter down on the table, it fluttered like a wounded bird. "Coward," he said. "Patient," Jon Arryn murmured. "Ambitious," Stannis said flatly, and the word was as dry as tinder. "He will bide, and he will balance, and he will count, and we will wake one day to discover that what is ours is in his hand, because we never put our hand strongly on it." "Pa," Robert said, "we have the hand on it. That matters." He smacked his palm on the table, and jugs jumped. Then he looked toward Arthur, perhaps to test himself against the eyes of a man who had known that son. Perhaps because even a king sometimes wanted the honesty of someone who would not tremble before him. "Well?" he demanded. "What do you think of your prince?" Arthur considered the letter and the men around the table. He considered the red stone roads and the thin water and the spear points that could rise from behind any rock. "He will not move until the ground is already shifted beneath our feet," he said. "Do not shake at him and expect him to show you teeth. He will smile and let you exhaust yourself. When you are tired, he will take the thing you dropped and call it courtesy." "Bessie." Robert made a noise that might have been a laugh and might have been a growl. "I like you," he said. Not as if he meant it as compliment or threat, but as if it were a fact like iron. "Do not," Arthur said without heat. "Like me. Use me." That drew a sharper laugh. "Dennis," Robert said. "See that the man is given something to stand guard over that requires a more interesting brain than a door. And sell me." He flicked a glance. "We will speak as I said." "Your Grace," Barristan said, his bow small and precise. Later, in the armory's cool dark, Barristan came to Arthur and stood for a while touching a rack of spears with the same thoughtful caution he would have used on a new horse's muzzle. "You know," he said at last without turning his head, "if it is commanded, I will not refuse. Not because I desire it, because the white is thin these days. It needs a weight that does not come from gold or wine." "Then take it," Arthur said. The words were not magnanimous. They were not even noble. They were practical. He had always been more practical than the songs had said. Barristan looked at him then. His eyes were not cold and not warm. They were the sort that have seen weather. "It might be that you should." "I would if it were needed," Arthur said. "But there is another need. This court is a map of grudges. Stannis glowers. The hand balances. The queen counts. The lion cub plays at boredom, while his father plays at patience. Robert is a storm. A white cloak with a Dornishman at its head will be a banner that calls old ghosts out to dance. Give them one less tune to jig to." He allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "I can be a sword without being the point of it." Barristan's mouth tilted a fraction. "You always did know how to stand where the light would strike steel." "Better steel than men's tongues," Arthur said. He drew his own blade, common castle-forged steel. In those days while dawn waited for him far to the southwest, a white memory he would one day touch again. He set the edge against a whetstone and loved the familiar sound of it, the rasp that had sung to him at the Tower of Joy like a wind across old rock. "Besides, I am tired of telling boys that songs are lies and hearing them think I am only being modest. You, Sir Barristan, are proof that sometimes a song turns out to be a manual for how to live." "God save us," Barristan said gently. "Do not let the singers hear you speak so." "Let them sing what they will," Arthur said, and the whetstone sang. Word went out in the days that followed. The sword of the morning stood in white by the stag. There were looks. There were shrugs. There were mutters behind hands. In the yard, more men came to test their edge against his, and went away better for it, which was a kind of penance he could pay that felt like profit. In the halls, he learned the way the courtiers' laughter thinned when he walked past and thickened when he had gone by. In the sept, he lit a candle and let it gutter out while he watched it. And he did not ask it for anything, and it gave him the small good gift of an hour in which to measure his breathing. In the Queen's apartments, beyond cedarwood and sown lilies, he found the new shape of his burden. He stood stoic while a Lannister cousin with the smile of a knife drawled about globes of sand, and he stood kinder while a maid from the west who had never seen the sea asked if all Dornishmen were truly as cruel as their stories. And he surprised himself by how gently he told her that stories shape what they are given like a potter, and that the clay had more to say about it than the potter would have you think. Once, he found himself alone at a window high above the city, while dusk laid the day down like a tired cloak. The roofs burned with a last light, and then they did not. Far below, boys shouted, and the clatter of wheels spoke of men who could not sleep until their own bodies had been exhausted. He put his hands on the stone sill and looked east, as if the tower in the Red Mountains could be seen from here if he looked exactly right and refused to blink. He closed his eyes and saw instead a small dark head rooting against a woman's breast, and then Eddard Stark's gray hand folding around a sword that shone like morning. He did not speak the name the world should never know. He let it sit in him, heavy and perfect as a star fallen to earth. Ashara's letters came to him via ways that did not include the small council. They were more full of water and wind than of words. She did not say the things any other sister might have said. She did not say them because she did not need to. And then, one day, when the mail came in heavy and full of the Lord's needs and sailors' complaints, a small folded paper lay among them like a quiet in a crowded room. He lifted it and broke the wax and read, "Brother, dawn is at starfall. It goes white even when the candles are out. If I pass the hall in the night, I can feel the light of it like a hand on my shoulder. Sometimes I think our family is nothing but a series of hands on shoulders, guiding and pressing. And now and then, holding us back from the cliff. You asked for truth. I owe you one. The truth is that I did not step off the tower. The truth is that I could have. The truth is that I stepped back because the sea was not mine to join yet. The cliff will be there when I am done with what I owe the living. There is a child at Starfall who laughs in his sleep. He is not ours. He is in the kitchen when he should be in the hall, and in the hall when he should be in the kitchen. He belongs to the morning and to none of us. And we love him as if he belongs to us anyway. Perhaps that is all there is to love. Come home when you can. If you cannot, stand where you are as if this were home. I have done the same in smaller rooms. A. He read the letter until the ink began to blur, and then he folded it and put it where his heart would warm it and told no one. The day that Robert made his choice about the White Sword's command, the air had a feel to it like before a storm when the leaves turn their pale bellies. Men came to the yard who had not been there in a month. Ladies lingered longer than their errands deserved. A blind beggar took up station just outside the gate. Even Pycelle paraded a little, his chain clinking with portent. Arthur waited by the column's shade because shade was honest. Barristan stood in the sun because that had always been his way. Jaime leaned upon a railing because he would always choose a place where he could fall without seeming to have slipped. Robert came red-faced and content from the butts, bow in hand, a look upon his face that spoke of meat and drink and a day's sweat in fair proportions. Jon Arryn walked with him like the voice of reason walking with the decision it would not be able to restrain. Stannis trailed, all angles and iron, and Cersei came from the other side with pages in her wake like gulls. "Here we are," Robert said, as if they had discovered themselves in his yard by chance. "Here we are, and we have this matter to resolve. And by the Father's beard, I will resolve it before I have any more wine." He glanced towards Cersei out of habit or sport. "My queen." "My lord," she said, and it meant less than it had on their wedding day, and more than it would in the years yet coming. Her eyes touched Barristan, slid to Arthur, rested upon Jaime a heartbeat longer than a heartbeat. "Sir Barristan is a pillar of your reign," she said. "He has the respect of men of every banner and city. To place him over the white would be to place order over confusion." Then Missandei. Robert's lip curled, whether in response to the opinion or to the way it was given. It was hard to tell. "Stannis." "It should be Selmy," Stannis said immediately, without generosity and without relish. "The Dornishmen will rouse the South. The boy will rouse the dragon of his family's shame. Selmy rouses nothing but obedience." "Dull old truth," Robert said approvingly. "Hand?" Jon Arryn looked at Arthur and at Barristan with the same old sadness that had watched men die on the step, in the Vale, at the Trident. "Sir Barristan has been a steady companion to every folly a king has managed since Aerys first lit a brazier," he said. "That kind of steadiness makes kingdoms last. Sir Arthur's presence honors us and will bring a quiet to places where we need quiet. Sir Jaime is young, and should be left to be young for a while longer." "Bah," Robert said cheerfully. He lifted his bow, took the string in his hand like a leash he could pull on the sky with. "Selmy, you will lead my white swords." He turned before any could be foolish enough to speak and added, "Dayne, you will be his right hand. Lannister, you will be his left, if you can keep your hand where I can see it." He grinned at his own jest and tossed the bow at a waiting page. Done? It was done. Men breathed as if they had been holding their breath for a long time. Barristan bowed. The smallest movement of the head a man who had been waiting to lift that weight had learned to make in order not to let it crush him. Arthur inclined his head to him, and they exchanged a look that was not celebration, and not remorse, and not relief, and was kin to all of them. Jaime did not bow. He smiled to show that he had not expected anything else. The Queen's mouth moved in something not unlike a smile, and not unlike a threat. Stannis' grimness did not alter because it had never had anything to do with a single moment. Jon Arryn sighed. Later, in the White Sword Tower, where the walls were lime-washed like a field under snow, the seven sat at a table as old as the city's first stones, and wrote their names in the book that had been the conscience of their order since men had first decided that kings needed guards besides their own good sense. Barristan took the quill and wrote with his small even script the new lines that fixed Arthur's name in the ledger, where the names settled into history like birds onto a branch. When he finished, he passed the quill. Arthur wrote his own hand, each letter no larger than it needed to be, as if he understood that boasting had no place on a page that had seen better men forget what boasting was. When Jaime took the quill, he flourished a little, as was his right and his need, and the ink showed where his wrist had tried to outrun his patience. They sat a while after with cups of watered wine, and the book lying open between them, like an old dog content to put its head on their boots. Barristan closed his eyes and opened them. "We will be measured," he said quietly, "against men who did not have to measure themselves against what we have done. It is an unfair measure. That is how measures are." Arthur watched the faint breeze lift the page's edge and let it fall. "Then let us make use of unfairness," he said. "If men expect less, we may be able to do more." "Always clever," Jaime murmured, but without sting. Arthur looked at him and smiled. "Teach me to be young," he said mildly. "I will teach you to be old." "You do not know the trick yourself," Jaime said, but he lifted his cup. "To the white, to the white," they said together. And the sound of their voices in that round room was a thing that resonated down stairwells and into years to come. It did not change the world in a day. The world resented changing. But a watch was set at the Queen's door that did not blink when Lannister cousins came bearing laughter. A blade that had only ever been lifted for a dragon now stood polished and ready for a stag. In the lists, men learned that the old ways of stepping into the strike still worked when the man teaching them had blood from a desert in his veins. In council, a tall quiet knight spoke 5 words when 15 had been expected, and the 5 made the 15 sit down and reconnoiter their argument. And in a high room, where a window framed a city that never slept because it feared the dreams it would have, Sir Arthur Dayne stood sometimes and looked east and thought of a sword hung above a hall like a piece of sky, trapped in stone. He would go home to it. Not yet. There were still vows to pay. There was work. Once, in a corridor that hugged the throne room's curve like a lover who did not want to be seen, Eddard Stark came up the stair, his step as grave and unyielding as that mountain's wind. They met beneath a slit that let in a blade of light. They did not embrace. They did not even bow. They paused. "Sir Arthur," Stark said. "Lord Stark," Arthur said. They held each other's gaze a long time. Then Eddard Stark inclined his head the smallest fraction. "He is well." "I am glad," Arthur said. The words were sufficient and more than any prayer. Eddard Stark's eyes softened. "I kept my oath," he said. "So did I," Arthur said. They stood one more heartbeat and went on their ways, carrying their separate halves of a secret, like 2 men bearing a chest between them, each taking the weight he had taken before, each trusting that the other would keep his grip when the stairs steepened. The wind sang along the red stone of the mountains, the same way it had sung the day the tower watched men die. In the yard, steel spoke to steel, and squires learned to keep their chins tucked and their feet under them. In Dorne, a prince set his game on the board. In the capital, a king laughed and roared and loved and broke, and would keep breaking until something stopped him. Or he stopped himself. In the White Sword Tower, old paper kept men's names safe as only paper can. In Starfall, a blade lay on a stand carved of pale stone, and it kept the light around it as if morning liked to nest there when night came too early. Sir Arthur Dayne moved through it all like a man moving through a familiar dream that had put on a different face. He knew the feel of sword hilt and of silence. He had learned the weight of a child's cry and of a king's laugh. He had become something that the songs would not quite be able to account for. It was enough. It would have to be. He lifted his hand and saw how steady it was and heard, in the quiet of his own skull, the rasp of a whetstone on steel. He stepped out into the yard where the sun put a clean white edge on the shadow he cast, and called a boy's name to come at him with a wooden blade. Because there are some ways a realm is kept that will never find their way into any book, and because the morning keeps coming whether men are ready for it or not. Okay. In the weeks after the king placed white upon him, the court learned the precise measure of Sir Arthur Dayne's silence. It was not a sulk, nor a shield. It was the kind of quiet a man makes when he knows what noise is worth, and will not spend it cheaply. Some men found that unsettling. Others found that they stood straighter when it passed. Some truths are contagious. He took his watches, tended his sword, and set himself to the small hard labors by which a life becomes an oath enacted rather than an oath merely spoken. He did not ask to sit the council when coin was counted. He did not carve himself into the flatteries that trailed the queen as tidy as a hem. He taught boys to balance their weight on the balls of their feet and break the habit of drawing in air at the first sting of a strike. In the evenings, he went to the sept and watched candles consume themselves into light, devouring their own substance to give a little radiance to men who could not afford again to be blind. The first task given him by the hand had nothing in it that looked like glory and everything that smelled of risk. John Arryn sent for him to the smaller solar, the one that looked east across the river, where a window seat bore the marks of children's heels from some other generation's games. The hand's face had been made by mountains and patience. He lifted his eyes from the letter that lay before him, and in them lay a calculation that had nothing to do with coins. "Dorne," he said. Arthur inclined his head. He could smell the desert from 3 rooms away whenever the name was spoken. It lived in men's tone like heat, under a cloak. "You will go," John Arryn said. "Not as a soldier. As a white sword whose edge is not only steel. The prince writes for peace. Peace that is watched is peace that holds. Peace that is neglected curdles into grievance." "Dayne, there are grievances enough," Arthur said. "We can carry some. We cannot carry them all." "Carry the one you can," Arryn said. "Your presence is a pledge, written in a language he will read." "Robert will let me go?" Arthur asked. He asked because men who had lived in the air of kings learned not to take for granted that the thing sense required would be the thing sense permitted. "I will make him," John Arryn said, and the faintest thinning of his mouth might have been humor. "A king can be persuaded of any good if you persuade him he thought of it himself." "Then I will go," Arthur said. He told Barristan first, because that was the manner in which a white sword honors the man who bears the burden of placing them. The Lord Commander received the news with the small grave nod that meant he had seen the thought in its cradle before it learned to walk. "Prince Doran will like the taste of respect," he said. "Give him enough that he feels his tongue again, and he may speak better sense than the realms give him credit for." "And if Oberyn is there," Arthur said. "Keep your throat covered," Barristan said dryly. And your smile sharpened. Jaime lifted a brow when the word reached him. "Bringing the desert to the desert," he drawled. "They will adore you, or stab you. Either way, the world will learn something," Arthur said. He looked at the boy. No longer a boy in body, but in the way he wore his certainty like a new cloak that had not yet learned his shoulders, and said without scorn, "Watch the queen while I am gone." Jaime's mouth did not tighten, only flickered, a candle stirred by air. "I have eyes," he said. "Make them calmer, Arthur replied, and left it at that. He went south with a small retinue that carried no banners. The road out of the Crown lands wound through fields that had not forgotten the tramp of soldiers' feet, and then into country where the grass grew in a corruption of wealth that would never visit the red stone. When the hills of the south finally shouldered into view, his breath changed without his bidding. He felt it lower in his chest, and something inside him that had kept a vigil he had not admitted. He kept rose to look over the wall. At the Boneway's crest, they halted. There lay the old road like a scar cut into the mountain's face by a knife that had chosen the shortest way and refused to apologize for the blood. The men with him shifted and spat and checked girths and checked them again, as if the leather might keep them safe from memory. Howland had once told him that no place is the same when you have left pieces of yourself there. He believed it again now, watching the wind lift dust from a bend he knew too well. They went down with care and with a courtesy to the land that a man gives a dangerous horse he respects. When at last they came to Sunspear's long spear stabbing at the sky, the sea's breath came over them like mercy. Arthur stood a moment and let it pass over his face. He could not see Starfall from here. He felt its name run through him anyway, as if his bones carried the taste of chalk. Prince Doran Martell received him not in the high audience chamber with its iron-boned windows and its carved dais, but in a shaded loggia where the sea made a ledger of light in the distance. A carafe sweated on a table between them, and the fruit in the dish had the scent of sun kept under a thin veil. Doran was as the letters, patient, heavy in the way of men who have endured pain until it became another habit, and precise. He thanked Arthur for coming as if it were a thing done for Dorn's honor, rather than the realm's convenience. He spoke of water. He spoke of roads. He spoke of the future in the way of men who never entirely let the present go, lest it slip from their fingers and fall. "We cannot forget," the prince said, and it had the simplicity of stone. "But we can choose when to remember. Let us remember in a way that feeds the living." Benderan. Arthur sat with his hands on his knees and let that enter him as sand enters a sandal, becoming part of the moving. "I am here to guarantee no column of Lannister gold marches through your passes while you are considering your memories," he said. "I am also here to drink your water. That last at least is in my power." Doran murmured and poured. They spoke too long to call it a single conversation, and not long enough to call it a friendship. Oberyn came and went as the breeze does when the day is deciding whether to be hot or merely warm. He entered like a knife enters fruit, clean and without apology. "White does not flatter you," he told Arthur with a smile that would have been called beautiful if it had not been so clearly delighted to be a threat. "You are a king's knife dressed as a priest's thought." "I am what I have to be," Arthur said. And because he would not let himself be cut to pieces by memory, he added, "And you are a prince's question dressed as a rumor." Oberyn laughed as a man laughs on a balcony, so that other men may hear it and draw their own conclusions. "I have missed you," he said, and kissed Arthur on both cheeks in the manner of a hospitality that cannot be argued with because it is already accomplished. "Go to Starfall. They will not forgive me if I keep you in Sunspear long enough to be called a jailer." He went to Starfall with 2 riders only, and they rode the last miles as men ride to a place where their mother taught them to swim, half afraid the river has gone shallow when their legs have forgotten that's what it is meant to do. The tower rose pale and clean as the inside of a shell, and the river at its foot made its eternal argument with stone. He smelled the salt there, thinner than Sunspear's, and the chalk, and the memory of a child running with damp hair clinging to his neck and calling to him to come look how the morning put coins of light on the water. Ashara was on the tower walk when he came into the yard, because men who have lived with someone long enough always find that the person they have not seen for years still knows when their foot will step on the stair. She took her time descending. He took his time dismounting. When she came to him, she did not reach for him, and he did not reach for her. They stood inside the space they had made for one another when they were young. "You have come for Dawn," she said. "I have come for you," he said plainly, because even a man who has chosen his vows must not let himself be remade by them into a coward. She smiled with a curve that belonged as much to the chalk brilliance as to the soft gold of her hair. "Then take both." she said, "and see if you can make use of one to keep faith with the other." He followed her through halls that remembered him in their coolness, and the sound of their steps laid down a memory for some future version of himself to walk alongside. In the great hall, the blade lay upon its stand, carved like waves tamed into order. The first time he had seen it, he had been too young to be the man everyone would require of him. He had grown into it like a tree grows into the fence that leans against it, and can no longer be separated entirely without someone being harmed. Dawn's white was not the white of his cloak. It was older, and it did not accept any name men had wanted to give to their chalks and bones. When he put his hands upon hilt and spine, the cool went into him, not out. He lifted in silence, and felt the old light align his bones for him, as if it still knew him better than he remembered himself. "You brought it home once," Ashara said. "Let me see you bring it away again." He belted the sword, and the weight that remembered him steadied him with more kindness than any word could have done. They went to the walk where the river wrote its name over and over, in the style of a child who loves his own letters. A small boy barreled from the shadows and collided with Arthur's leg and bounced back with the careless grace of children who have not yet learned that the world can bruise them. The boy looked up at the white cloak and the larger white at the knight's hip and decided this was a story. He laughed as if he could not help it. "You must be more careful with the world, Edric," Ashara told him in a tone that said no such thing could possibly be true soon. "It is too big to avoid," the boy answered, and grinned at Arthur. "Are you my uncle?" "Yes," Arthur said, because in some ways he was uncle to all the living that this house would protect, and because the boy, sun and stone, he had Davos quickness in him and a Dayne's eyes, had asked in a way no man had asked him anything in years, honestly. "Then teach me to be old," the boy demanded without preface, reverting to the seriousness of 6. "Mother says you are old like stories. I want to be old like that without the creaks." "Well, come back to me when your knees begin to speak to you," Arthur said gravely. "We will see what translation we can devise." The night they gave each other words at last came with crickets, not songs. Ashara set a cup beside him on the tower walk and stood with her hands on the parapet, looking east where the world paled before it took breath. She did not apologize for the thing they had not had. He did not claim for himself a grievance over the thing they could not undo. They spoke instead about what could yet be tended. "The realm is a table with too many legs," she said. "If one breaks, the table lists, and men spill what they were eating and call it a disaster. They should put their hands to the board." "They keep knives in those hands," Arthur said. "It makes them careful of how much weight they put down." She looked sideways at him and smiled, and the dawn caught the edge of it and made it into a thing that a man might lay down on a desk under the king's leer and say, "Here is the reason a realm survives a year longer than it could have. Bring dawn to places where knives are a language." She said, "And translate." He left 2 days later before the sun struck the river into coin again, because leaving while the world is being kind is the only way to keep the kindness from spoiling. He kissed his sister on the brow and the boy on the hair, and he carried White Light south again, then north. When he came into the Red Keep's yard wearing his own white steel upon white wool, more men than he expected looked up and made the small inward motion that men make when their body takes a decision before their brain catches up. They felt some shift, even if they could not put a name to it. Robert laughed when he saw it. Laughed not at him, but at the way the morning sprang from its scabbard, with a gentleness that made the king's rough joy ring sweeter for a heartbeat. "You brought your witch's blade back," he said. "Good. I like having my ghosts on my side. Ghosts cut," Arthur said, and stood at his place. He thought the days would pass thus in small instruments of steadiness, until the realm learned the tone he was trying to teach it. He had given up his right to ask the world to be generous with him. Men like him asked only that the world be clear. The world answered with fire and salt. A rider came in at noon with his horse wide-eyed, and the sweat dried upon both of them in dusty curls. He made for the hand and spoke to the page who guarded the small council chamber, as if words could be saved by being said at speed. John Aaron came out and took the message and read, and he did not lift his head for a long breath. When he did, his eyes went first to Stannis Baratheon, and then to Robert, who had come like a storm that chooses where it will strike, and dares the coast to be surprised. Lannisport's fleet, Jon Arryn said. He had the gift of saying the fact first and putting the fear under it, so it had to find its way out on its own. Burned at anchor by the Ironborn. Robert's mouth shaped a curse that wore the father's name for cover. Stannis did not blink. He did not need to. The lines in his face settled deeper as if the sea had carved them in and was returning for more. "They will want to mean it," Robert said. "They will want me to mean my answer." "Then mean it," Stannis said. And his voice held a satisfaction that might have been hatred of weakness, and might have been the rare pleasure of being able to give a thing what it deserved. "Give me the fleet." "You will have it," Robert said at once, gleam in his eye like light off clean steel. "Every hull in King's Landing, every oar. If you have to yoke oxen to a plow and send it to sea, you will do it." "And you?" Stannis asked flatly. "I." Robert's grin was a wound the world would not forgive and loved anyway. "I will go and knock on Pike's door with my hammer until the door thinks itself a skull and breaks. Ned will come down with the North's cold stones and I will drive a path for him. Dayne." He turned without the slightest doubt that the man he called would not be where calling could reach him. "You will be at my side." "Your Grace," Arthur said simply. He put his hand upon his sword not to swear it, but because hands seek habit when the ground shifts. The realm's great animal began to move, groaning as hinges that had not known their purpose in years were asked suddenly to remember it. Messengers went like gnats. Lists were unrolled, and men's names called. Bakers counted flour, and sailors counted rope, and smiths counted irons, and boys counted days until, somehow, the counting would end, and the thing would become happening. The Queen watched it all with a face that had done so much work to become unreadable, that even when she smiled one saw the exertion. She watched Arthur too with a gaze like a cat's consideration of a new piece of furniture. Once he caught Jaime's eye upon him when he was not meant to know it was there. Jaime looked away and then looked back, and did not look away again. The boy had learned that sometimes it is better to feel a pain in the eye than to live with a pain in the spine. They went. The king rode with a ferocity that did not always translate into tidiness. He ignored the quagmire to seek firm ground because he believed with the absolute confidence of the victorious that desires a map. Often enough for men like him it is. He bellowed and sang and swore and drank when he was permitted, and drank when he was not. He was not a good general. He was a weapon. Jon Arryn was a general. Stannis was the war's conscience. Arthur was the white along the weapon's edge that kept it cutting, and did not let it turn to rust in its own blood. At Seaguard, Jason Mallister kept his elegant courtesy like a flag even in crisis, which is what men made flags for. He welcomed the king, and turned his handsome head toward the sea, with a bitterness he did not bother to hide when he spoke of the Ironborn's insolence. The bells of the booming tower pealed over the water like a threat in a language ships understood. "It will do them good to hear you," Mallister told Robert. "The Ironborn think the rest of us are weak because we prefer bread to salt. Teach them that men can choose their manner of strength." "I'll teach them to love the taste of mud," Robert roared, strangely merry with rage. He loved an enemy who announced himself plainly. He hated the quiet knife. Stannis took the fleet like a miser taking his own coffers back from a debtor he had always despised. The shipwrights of the narrow sea had built him stout hulls. He asked them to be more than stout. He sent them into weather. He met the Iron Fleet off Fair Isle, where waves came angled and wind tested men's knees, and the sea threw up white where it broke itself on old rock. The Raven brought the news to Pike while Arthur watched the king pace the strand like a bull tethered, and hearing the heifer's scent carrying downwind from the next field. Stannis burned their ships to the waterline with a kind of cold pleasure only a man who has seen hunger can enjoy. Even the Ironborn have a religion. That day it met a more practical god. The king crossed. The Northmen came down, quiet as always, even when oars struck in unison. Men from the Vale with their hawk badges, and men from the Riverlands who carried their fear the way other men carry water for a companion. Without complaint, because complaining is another thirst you must slake. Men of the Reach came late, carrying their softness with them, and arguing that it was strategy. Men of the Westerlands were chastened and furious and impatient to pay their debts. At Pike, the sea chewed stone and spat it back in smaller pieces. The black walls rose with the arrogance the world had not quite learned to disapprove of, and the bridges swung with a menace that delighted the men who had learned to walk them with their bare feet like geckos. Arthur stood at the king's shoulder while Robert eyed the grim fortress with the proprietary air of a smith examining a challenging fort. "There," he said, as if there were a god's finger pointing at the exact stone. "We will put our weight there, and when they lean, we will step aside and let them do the last injury to themselves." Barristan came up from the quarrier's marks with white at his temples and blood on his gauntlet, not his own. "I will take the breach," he said, calm as if asking for the wine jug at supper. "I will go with you," Arthur said. Robert's eyes narrowed with the pleasure he took in the possibility of song. "If one of you dies, I will be short of stories for my cups for a decade," he said, "and I will never forgive you." "Then do not let us die," Barristan said, and smiled the way mountains smile in winter when snow lies thin and the rock shows through. Thoros of Myr had wine on his breath and a fire in his hand. He came grinning and set the edge of his robe alight, as if it were a good jest to put on as you might put on courage. Arthur had seen men who believed in gods, and men who believed in themselves, and men who put their faith in steel, because steel did not lie or drink or fall asleep. He had not seen many men who believed the way Thoros did, that the world liked a fool, and would sometimes let him through where a wise man would be turned back. He did not mind following such a man into a breach. He simply made certain that he knew where the solid stone lay to put his back to when the fool's luck ran thin. The assault began in an argument of thunder that made the sea itself seem hushed. Ladders went up, and men went up them with the bewildered determination of creatures who have agreed with themselves to become narrower than a ladder and quicker than an arrow. Rocks fell. Oil fell. The world narrowed to the toe of a boot, and the rung in front of your face, and the weight at your back, and the grunt of the man above you as someone below his eyesight decided he should not climb any more today. Arthur went where the white needed to be seen for a moment, and then vanished where shadows were useful. He moved with Barristan because the rhythm of their years had taught them how to be in two places at once, together and not in one another's way. Thoros cried out something to a god and flung himself through a slit of stone that glowed for an instant, as if dawn had placed its finger there and were withdrawing it in surprise. Men shouted. Steel rang all. The breach went from a place where no one could be to a place where everyone had to be all at once. Inside, the corridors took the sound of battle and multiplied it as a hill takes a shepherd's call and throws it back until the sheep don't know which way to run. Arthur learned in such places to trust his feet, not his ears. He took 3 steps around a corner and met a man whose beard was braided with shells and whose eyes were bright with the kind of rage that does not require a reason. He parried low, turned the blade aside with a courtesy that wasted the man's momentum, and then put the edge of dawn against the man's arm and felt the white light go through flesh without changing. It had always startled him, the way the sword did not pick up heat or complaint. It was as if even the blood accepted it as a thing that belonged to a place beyond blood's authority. They fought up a stair where water ran down the risers as if the sea had been invited in, and had accepted and was trying to be polite about not ruining the floor. Barristan took a cut to the shoulder that would have laid a lesser man out like a board. He did not go down. He said something to the man who had cut him that would have been a blessing if it had not been a curse. And then the man learned what an old knight knows about the places a younger man forgets to guard because he believes his youth will defend them. The inner courtyard lay ahead, and Arthur saw the moment when many roads met at once. The king's men rushed in from the right, men in trout badges from Seaguard and men with the crowned stag, and men with oars tattooed on their knuckles to show where their strength had been learned. From the left came men with a mermaid upon their shields and rage in their mouths. Overhead, the sky knifed itself into thin blue between walls that had decided today to be cliffs instead of masonry. In the far arch, a great-shouldered man wearing iron plates stitched into leather bellowed a challenge at no one and everyone. Arthur had enough time to see Barristan's face go whiter than his cloak. Victarion, someone near him said, and the name had the weight of a drum in it. The Iron Captain came on like weather. His axe sailed and dropped and sailed again like a gull that has learned men carry fish in their hands. He had a way of forcing air out of men without touching them. The space around him felt smaller, the choice thinner, the odds narrower. Barristan went to meet him because there was no version of this day in which he would not. Arthur went too, because there were places on the board where you do not leave your favorite pieces alone. The first two exchanges were not fights. They were acquaintance. Victarion discovered that Barristan's age had no rot in it, and that the white beside him moved in a manner that made the space between the two men deeper and more treacherous than any other part of the yard. Barristan discovered that Victarion's temper did not impede his patience. Arthur discovered that the Ironborn's surprise at dawn's color vanished as quickly as it came. Only fools stare too long at a blade's beauty when its edge is writing a sentence meant for their bone. The third exchange became what the bards would later flatten into lines a drunk man could remember. Barristan took the axe high and turned it with an economy of motion that felt like a prayer composed by a man who loves simple words. Arthur went low and slid Dawn along the edge of a shield to show it where to come apart. Here, put your weight there. Give me that gap, and now. Victarion came through it laughing because pain pleased him when it was not his, and sometimes when it was. He stamped, and the ground seemed to put its foot down with him, and Barristan slipped half a breath. That was enough to make his shoulder cry out a second time and decide it would carry no more of this day's load. He fell to one knee and did not fall further, because Arthur was already where he would be. The Iron Captain saw the new angle and swung for it with the confidence of a man who has built his life on seizing the new angle when it appears. Arthur stepped into him. He stepped into him the way a man steps into a wave, not trying to dominate it, but learning where it will curl and putting his body where the curl will spend itself without taking the man under. Dawn met the axe haft and walked along it, like light along a street at dawn, and then leapt with a crispness that had nothing in it of struggle. The axe had spun. Victarion took a blow with his fist that would have unmade any man whose jaw had not been taught endurance by better teachers. Arthur felt the shock up his arm and let it pass through him into the ground, the way a tree takes lightning and refuses to become a story about a widow woman and a lost orchard. They moved again. The world narrowed again. Someone shouted a name that meant nothing here. The Iron Captain put his shoulder into Arthur's chest, and the world went white with the breath slammed from him. He let his body choose rather than his brain, and found his feet again, not because he was clever, but because this is what years of mornings in a yard with a blade had been for. Dawn flashed. The Iron Captain's gauntlet split. Blood burned out into the air like a story that has been waiting too long to be told. Victarion laughed again. Stubborn and joyful because a man like him knows how to admire the enemy who has finally taught him fear's true face. And then the yard was full of other men, and the battle ceased to be between one man and two. The Iron Captain's own men came like tide. Northmen surged like a wall of pines broken loose in a flood. Robert's roar tore the courtyard's air and made the ravens above settle their wings. The moment was not lost. The moment was ended. Barristan's hand closed upon Arthur's arm and closed again, because that was how he asked for permission to stand when his body had not granted it on its own. Arthur lifted him. They stood. The day, which had never promised any one man anything, went on. The king sat upon the smashed stones of a hall at dusk and ate meat with his fingers and drank from a cup that someone handed him without even glancing to see if it was poisoned, because the thing in him that feared death had a different shape than other men's. His face glowed with the sweat of victory. He looked upon Barristan with a softness that was rare, and upon Arthur with something that might have been recognition and might have been gratitude, and would be called either until the end of days, without men ever agreeing which was the true word. "You saved my old knight," he said, jabbing a finger with affection toward the man whose sling had not yet been tied but would be before the moon rose. "Barristan saved himself," Arthur said. "I moved with him." "You moved well," Robert said. He sucked fat from his thumb and then used the same hand to gesture, careless of grease. "Listen to me," he said. And when he said that men did not always listen, he did not punish them for it. "We will be done here in a handful of days. We will hang the squids we have to hang and smother the ones the sea loves too much to relent. Then we will go home, and when I sit that chair of knives again and drink where the spiders put the cups on trays, I will say a thing that will not please everyone. But I am the king. I say things because I am the king. I say things because I am the king." He drank. He looked not at Arthur and not at Barristan but at the space between them, and for a beat his gaze saw farther than most men's ever did. "Sell me," he said almost softly. "You carry the white as if it were the only color the world has left. That is why I love you. But a man must lead who can talk to boys who think their father's sins are virtues. I want them steadied by a hand they will think is unromantic, and will in time call proof against the wrong sort of song." "Your Grace," Barristan said. It could have been a protest. It could have been acceptance. It was neither. It was the sound a man makes when he has already thought the thought that has been put in front of him, and is now setting his feet in the ruts that thought requires. "Arthur Dayne," Robert said, and his voice rang sudden with the odd mixture that was the only reason he had the crown. The lust for a fight and the grief at a friend's grave yoked to one purpose. "When we return you will take the command of my white swords." The fire popped. Men in the ring of shadow glanced at one another and then pretended they had not. The sea breathed. Barristan's face changed in a way that was visible only to Arthur. Small, then smaller, until it was merely the set of an old truth that had learned a new way to stand and did not complain about the weight. "Your Grace," Arthur said, because there was one correct shape for any response that kept men within the guardrails of dignity. And then, because he had been given the duty in open ground, and would honor it in open ground, he added, "If Sir Barristan counsels me once when pride would make me deaf, I will count his counsel a favor equal to life, saved in the breach." "See?" Robert said to no one and everyone, ferocious joy flaring in his eyes like an old habit. "He says the good thing before it can be used against him. Give me 10 men like this and that chair would be a stool, and I would sit it as if it were a rock under a pine." Barristan put out his hand. Arthur took it. The clasp said what neither of them would waste the world's time upon. Praise that didn't require the shape of a word. The compact between craftsmen. The agreement that the work mattered more than the name stamped on the blade. When they returned to King's Landing, the bells told the city that a war had been remanded, and taxes would grow out of it like mushrooms after a rain. The Queen's lips bent into a shape Court called a smile. John Aaron nodded and began to add a new column of calculations to the page he kept hidden behind his other books. Stannis came ashore a conqueror, and looked as if he had been cheated because nothing had paid back hunger fast enough for his taste. Varys breathed, and the breath smelled of cinnamon and quiet. Littlefinger counted and flicked a bit of parchment into the air, as if the whole realm were a scrap to be played with on a bored afternoon. In the yard, under a sky that had made itself startlingly blue out of self-congratulation, Robert set a new white cloak upon Arthur's shoulders. It lay as if it had been cut by a hand that had measured him years ago and remembered. Jaime stood very still. The gold in his hair made a commentary of its own. When the acclamations died, no chorus. Only men clapping their palms together like masons knocking a stone into place. Barristan reached and settled the clasp with such particular care that for the image of one instant, everyone there was a boy watching a father tighten the straps of a new saddle. The white sword tower took his footfall and learned it. He moved into the chamber set aside for the Lord Commander, and found it held nothing different from the cell he had used before, except a table for a book, and a window whose angle allowed him to see the river's curve. He set his hand on the table's edge, and felt where other men's hands had rested when they wrote. The book lay closed. He did not touch it. He would, but he would not make a ceremony of haste. He stood instead at the window, and watched a barge move against the current with the confidence of many backs at one order. He thought, the thing we do that holds is the thing that looks most like love, and least like pleasure. He did not know if it was true. He found that believing it made him more useful. He changed small things. He did not put his stamp on them. He only set them so. He required the morning practice for whites and golds together twice a week, and then 3 times, and he stood there himself so that the men who could not be ordered by anyone else would be able to say they had been ordered by him. He instituted a rotation of night watches that took into account which men spoke softly, and which walked like drums. The Queen slept better for it, though she would never admit it. He required that each man of the White put 5 lines a month into a small ledger kept not in the book, but beside it. 5 lines only, to be written by their own hand, noting a thing they had done that no one would sing about. The first month, the ledger was thin. The third month it was thicker. By the 6th, there was a quality to the ink on those few pages that did not live in the songs sung in the lower halls. This was a true record of what a realm requires of men who boast titles others envy. He stood with Jamie and watched the boy make a flourish with his wrist that had earned him praise when he was 15 and would get him killed when he was 25. Again, Arthur said, without the lie. Jamie scowled, then did it, and did not scowl because the thing felt better in his hand. I do not like being taught, he said, then added with honesty that would have grieved his father, except by those I can believe. Believe my boredom, Arthur said lightly. I have no time for being impressed. You are a very rude Dornishman, Jamie replied. But the color of his eyes was warmer and less restless, and the next time Circe passed in the yard, his blade was 2 inches lower than Pride would have kept it a month ago. Varys came to him once, humming a phrase that a singer had been trying out in the street, standing with his hands nested inside one another like pigeons. A realm breathes easier when its mornings are clear, he said. You are a morning with a will. I am a man, Arthur said, too tired to play. And Varys's bead eyes softened for a heartbeat. And Arthur understood something then. Even spiders remember being boys in pavilions once. He said, there is a child in the north who must not become prey to anyone's plan. Ah, Varys said, as if he had been told a recipe for a soup he had already made and was being asked not to add too much salt. Wolves are protective of their whelps. So are men who have cut their own brothers down to defend the idea of a promise, Arthur said. If you or any of the birds that carry your little ribbons of news ever bring harm to this child, by act or word or silence, I will find each of the feet of those birds and break them in my hands one by one before I come for you. Varys inclined his head. He did not flutter. What a vivid image, he murmured. Do not fear. When I think of the realm, I think of boys. Think of this one, Arthur said, and turned away. Once, Jon Arryn came to the White Sword Tower late, and they sat with a lamp between them that made their faces into the likenesses of men who had aged farther than they had. My wife wishes for a child, the hand said. The realm wishes for many things. A man grows expert at inventorying other people's wishes. A man grows patient at learning which wishes he can withstand without cruelty, Arthur said. Jon Arryn looked wearily grateful. There are fewer men at court who speak as if the words they speak were worth something, he said. Do not let yourself be starved for company. Even a good man needs others near him who remember that mornings do not come on their own. Bender. Ned Stark remembers, Arthur said. Stannis remembers in a different key. Selmy remembers. Even Jaime will learn to remember if he is allowed to decide that doing so was his own idea. Jon Arryn smiled then. A small, tired thing. Persuade Robert that the notion was born in him. And this realm could be made of things it deserves, he said. He stood, shook out his cloak, and paused at the door. When the day comes that I am gone, he said offhand, what you have set in order will be shaken. Then I will put it in order again, Arthur said. He said it the way a man says he will go to the well in the morning and draw water and drink. He did go north once, not for ceremony, but because the king decided that the sight of him drinking with the Lord of Winterfell would put a particular fear into the men of a particular river town who had become too learned at finding excuses why taxes should be divided like loaves among thieves. He went with a small retinue. He did not go inside the great hall when the feast was called. He went instead to the yard when the yard was empty and stood under the patched banners that floated their wolves. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. The North always put its hand into a man's ribcage and touched him where he had been a boy. Eddard Stark found him there because Eddard Stark was the sort of man who always found him where it was correct. They stood and said nothing. Somewhere a boy laughed and then tried to stifle the sound, and then let it out again unwillingly because some pleasures do not accept a bit. The boy came running past, a streak of dark hair and splay-footed speed, and another boy followed at a more careful pace. And then a girl in a woolen dress that did not acknowledge a prince or a king ran beyond both in pursuit of some god only girls know. Arthur kept his eyes on the flags. "He will be a good man," he said. "He will be a man," Eddard said, and his tone held both hope and fatalism. "I will make the world give him time to work out the first half of that sentence." "You will," Arthur agreed. They did not speak the name. They did not need it. A raven called from the rookery tower, as if it was practicing grief for some future it had been warned of. Arthur then did a thing he had told himself he would not do. He went where he should not. He found himself in a corridor not far from the rooms a lord reserves for guests who are not strictly guests, and a door opened, because doors do that when men are walking in corridors. A woman came out with a basket, and her hair pinned in a haphazard clutch, because she had been working and did not mind being seen so. She wore a look that women wear when they have washed a child's hair and argued him into his shirt, and sent him into the yard with a warning not to cut his new boots while climbing the fence. She saw the white upon him and stepped back a fraction, not out of fear, but out of that automatic rearrangement of posture that common folk learn when nobility passes. A bracing to be misunderstood. Arthur inclined his head. She inclined hers. The moment went on. Then a boy's voice from behind the door cried out some nonsense about a sword being a stick that had learned manners, and the woman laughed without intending to. And Arthur's heart broke for a second, and then put itself back together with a new seam he would touch on bad nights and say, "That is where I closed it." At supper, he sat between the king and the hand, and watched men who had never left their river see a king drink as if drink would pay them back for the winter they could not afford. He watched Caitlin Stark with her straight mouth and her caution. He watched the across-the-table glance between her and her husband and learned again the shape love takes when it has survived long enough to weave itself into duty, rather than require duty to clothe itself in elaborate lies. He did not look down the table to the boys. He did not need to. He knew where each of them sat by the way the air held the sound their laughter made. When he was Lord Commander a year, the book took his hand and made him write more often than any man had written in 2 generations. He set down that Sir Barristan Selmy had saved men from a burning galley off Fair Isle with his arm in a sling. He wrote that Jaime Lannister had thwarted an assassin in the Queen's bedchamber with a left-handed cut that surprised him into humility for a week, and then became a story he told only to Arthur, to be mocked in private, so he could learn how to live with it. He wrote that a squire named Cale had pulled a girl from the path of a runaway cart and broken his own wrist for it, and he wrote the name of the girl's mother in the margin because some pages honor not just the men in white. He took Lord Commander as a job, not a title. The men who liked titles did not like him for it. The men who liked work learned that they liked him well enough. When he walked in the yard now, the sun found the white on his shoulders and made it bright, and the boys lifted their faces in the way boys do when the man with the answers that do not coddle them goes by. It was not love. It was not awe. It was attention. He preferred it to both. He did not go back to Starfall again that year. He did not go because men like him learned to ration their joys the way they ration water. On a hard ride, he sent letters. Asharis came back with tidings of a boy who fell into the river and learned to stand up in the current and laugh because he had thought himself doomed and had found himself held up by the river's will to carry as well as to drown. He sent coin quietly, not out of shame but out of the understanding that families, even old ones, need to be reminded that bread is a more immediate kindness than names. He touched Dawn sometimes and let it teach him the exact insistence of its weight. When John Aaron sickened, the first word came to him, not with a crier's voice and a physician's pomp, but through a kitchen girl who always saved the heel of the bread for the smallest guard on duty, because she had been that small and hungry once. She said the hand could not keep his food, and that his eyes had gone like water left in a glass too long on the sill. Arthur went at once, and found the old man with his patience cracked and leaking, and his hand cold under the blankets. "It's a woman," he whispered, a wildness in his voice that had nothing to do with fever, and everything to do with the shock of having been wrong for too many years in small ways that put him at the edge of being wrong in a large one. It was a woman who killed him. Who? Arthur asked, because plain questions are the only ones to ask men who are dying. I don't know, Jon Arryn said, and then did not say anything else worth writing. He died as men die who have overestimated the appetite of their bodies for service. The king howled and roared, and took a hunt rather than a council, because grief and politics share a bed only in hymns. The queen's lids lowered, and lifted and lowered again. And if you watched closely enough, you could see where the blink had been something exercised into the shape of a politeness long ago, and then assumed as a habit. The realm shivered. The north would be asked for its lord. Arthur went that evening to the White Sword Tower, and stood with the book open to Jon Arryn's small careful lines, as if there should have been a page where the hand's deeds were measured alongside murders and battles. He wrote instead 3 extra lines in his little ledger of unremarkable acts. Barristan sat with the old man an hour and held a cup to his lips. Jaime stood a watch not his own. The Lord Commander told a kitchen girl her bread saved a guard's strength. None of it made a defense against what came. All of it made them men rather than pieces on a board. Eddard Stark came. He came like a season. The air changed, the light lay differently in the hallways, and the king's laugh altered its timbre. Arthur watched it happen as a weather-wise farmer notes the way birds decide their nests are too near the ground. He stood at the pillar in the throne room when the king threw his arm around the Northman's neck and asked for kindness from the man who would not give it if kindness became permission for the world's worst appetites to eat their fill. He watched the queen's face grow thinner and her brother's stare sharpen and soften, as if he were testing it for the right temperature. He did his work. He put men where they might be useful. He watched from the White Sword Tower while the lines were laid down that would later be called history. He walked past Varys and Littlefinger speaking soft as hair on a pillow, and did not pause because he already had said the thing he needed to say, and would not waste it by repetition. He taught boys to lower their sword 2 inches. He wrote in a ledger what was not being written anywhere else. On certain mornings when the river's breath came up and made the banners speak in whispers that sounded like the surf on the palm, he went to the window and thought of Starfall. On other mornings he stood in the yard and considered Jaime's step and the set of his shoulders, and the way his anger had learned not to show itself until it would be most useful. On nights when the king came through the tower like a storm and the queen like a blade in linen, he stood and counted breaths and considered all of the pauses in the world that men mistake for peace. He had been Lord Commander long enough to know that the day would come when his steadiness would not be enough to keep the chair from becoming not merely a chair. He had not been Lord Commander so long that he had forgotten how to walk into a breach before the song got around to counting him. He would step where a foot was needed. He would hold where the weight had to be put. He would break when the breaking point came, and he would not make a ceremony of it. He would do these things because the morning is not a metaphor. It is a time of day when men get up and do the work set before them, while the light is still cool. On a day when the sky had the pale look of fish belly, and the river harnessed a line of barges that looked like beads on a string held too taut, he opened the white book at last to his own page. He had written other men's lines. He had written of the drought broken by a canal Stannis forced through stubborn marsh, and of the king's long ride to a sick child's bed in the city's poorest quarter, because Jon Arryn had forced the ride upon him, and the king had come away swearing at the gods for making children so small. He had written of Barristan taking a cut for a boy in the yard that would have undone an unguarded belly, and of Jaime bending his pride to stand a double watch while Cersei was bled. He had written the names of men who had no songs at all, and now would have at least a few lines of script to make the silence gentler. He wrote his own now. He wrote not that he had survived the Tower of Joy. The book did not require confessions nor secrets. He wrote that he had bent the knee when the realm chose a king it could live with, that he had carried his oath from one room to another without spilling it, that he had put white where the world demanded white, and not demanded of it that it be admired for being a difficult color to keep clean. He wrote that in Pike's Yard he had helped Sir Barristan Selmy to his feet and kept him there, and that the breach had taken their breath and given it back, because sometimes breath is given back when a man proves he will not spend it on boasts. He lifted his head. Jaime stood in the doorway with his hair pulled back for a change and his eyes not bored. "It is a good page," the younger man said, and there was not a lick of mockery in it. "It will have more lines," Arthur said. Jamie smiled like a man who has decided to live with the discomfort of being given a lesson he did not ask for, and will in time be grateful for. "We all will," he said. The morning went on. Candles burned. Bread broke. Men swore and men prayed. Across a river, boys argued about which spear had the best balance when thrown, and which horse would be fastest past the fishmonger's cart. In a tower pale as hope, a sister put her hand on the blade of a sword that had slept and did not cut it, because some edges know whom they are meant to injure, and whom they are meant to steady. In the north, a boy ran and fell and rose and laughed, because he had discovered that falling did not end him. In a palace, a spider spun. A deer stamped. A wolf lifted its head to scent the wind. Sir Arthur Dayne moved through all of it with the measured step of a man who had chosen his weight and would carry it without practicing any astonishment at the distance. He said a boy's name in the yard, and the boy came to him with a wooden blade that was already learning where its weight should be. He lifted his own practice sword and set the world to its lessons again. They spoke of conspiracies in corners meanwhile, in rooms that had more carpet than air. Men laid their plans upon the flat of their hands, as if the lines of their palms foretold compliance. A queen sharpened her subtraction. A king doled happiness to himself in heavy draughts. A hand lay under stone. A friend left his home to come into hazard. A whisperer wrapped an old truth in a new ribbon. But in the white sword tower, a page dried as ink darkened into permanence, and its line said something about a dawn that had learned patience. And the morning outside lived up to its name without asking anyone permission.